Welcome back, friends. In the previous session we discussed about facilitated diffusion, and in today's session we are continuing with another method of transportation, which is active transport. So as we discussed, these are the methods of transportation or ways of transportation. We said we have passive, then we have active transport, then we have mass flow. So in passive transport, we have discussed about osmosis, about simple diffusion, and facilitated diffusion. And in today's session, we are going to discuss about active transport. And if God wishes, we'll finish with mass flow before we are starting transportation in the plants. Now, about active transport, it is different from passive. The major difference between passive transport and active transport is that active transport uses energy in the form of ATP. Facilitated diffusion is similar to active transport because facilitated diffusion occurs through protein channels which are present on the cell membrane. Also, active transport occurs through protein channel, but the difference between facilitated diffusion and active transport is that the protein channel used in active transport, they require ATP in order for them to function. Now we are saying that active transport is the energy consuming transport of molecules or ions across a membrane against a concentration gradient. This is also one among the very important characteristics of active transport that you need to know, that the transportation of materials in active transport, it is against the concentration gradient, Now, what do we mean when we are saying it is against concentration gradient? As we know, in diffusions, material they are moving along concentration gradient. Now, when we are saying the concept of along concentration gradient, what do we mean? Let's say we have a membrane here. And if this is the membrane, let's say we have concentration C1 in this side and concentration C2 in this side. Now, if concentration C1 is greater compared to concentration C2, which is lower. Now, if we are saying that material they are moving along concentration gradient, means they are moving from higher concentration to low concentration. This is a long concentration gradient. But if material they are moving in reverse direction from lower concentration to higher concentration, this is against concentration gradient. And this is what is done by the active transport. Material they are moving from lower concentration to higher concentration. So in the discussion of active transport, it is very important for you to remember that we will be discussing about the movement of materials against the concentration gradient, and not only concentration gradient, because concentration gradient, it is the chemical gradient, but also we'll be discussing about the movement of materials against the electrical gradient. So combine the concentration and electrical gradient, we are calling it as against the electrochemical gradient. Now, the term against concentration implies materials, that means ions or molecules, are moved from low concentration to higher concentration against their natural tendency to move in opposite direction. So the natural tendency of materials is to move from higher concentration to the lower concentration. So if we want to go against the natural tendency, we must apply some energy. And this energy, we are using it in the form of ATP. And such kind of movement, they are called active transport. Now, when the molecules or ions move through plasma membrane from lower concentration, such a movement when the molecules or ions move through the plasma membrane from lower concentration to higher concentration, they require energy for such movement. The energy is provided by the ATP, which is provided by oxidative phosphorylation. This is how we discussed it in the topic of respiration in the previous session. So the energy which is stored in ATP comes from oxidative phosphorylation. Without respiration, active transport is therefore impossible. Without respiration, active transport is therefore impossible. So active transport depends more on respiration. In absence of respiration, active transport cannot proceed as how it was required to proceed. So let's continue with our discussion. About active transport. Now, let's take a good example and a very simple example about active transporting by discussing the active transport or the maintenance of the cell membrane. I mean the charge on the cell membrane. As we know that the charge inside of the cell is always negative, while outside of the cell is always positive. Now, what maintains the negative charge inside of the cell and the positive charge outside of the cell? It is the active transport. Now, how does this occur, and what is the mechanism which maintains this charge? Let's see. Now, we are saying that the major ions inside the cell and in the environment are sodium ions. So, the major ions outside the cell and inside, they are sodium, potassium, and chloride ions. These are the major ions inside and outside. But now let's look at the distribution of these ions. Look at the figure below, which shows that the concentration of these ions are very different inside and outside of the human red blood cell. Now, this is not only in the human red blood cell, but it is in almost all plasma membrane. The distribution of these ions is like this way. Sodium ions in the plasma, they are at higher concentration as compared to inside of the cell. Potassium ions inside the cell, they are higher concentration as compared with that in the plasma. Chloride ions in the plasma, they are at higher concentration as compared to inside of the cell. Now, how does the concentration of these ions is maintained? If we want to perform the active transport of sodium ions, it will be from outside to the inside, because inside has a lower concentration compared to the outside. So the active transport of sodium ions will be from the higher concentration, which is outside, to the lower concentration, which is inside. And if we want to perform the active transport of potassium ions, that means it will be from inside to the outside. Inside we have higher concentration of potassium ions, and outside we have lower concentration of potassium ions. So the active transport of potassium ions will be from inside to outside. Now, let's see how active transport is very important in the maintenance of concentration of these ions. We are saying that concentration of sodium, potassium, and chloride ions in red blood cell and their environment measured as milli or millimolar. This capital M is molar. Now, for example, like in most cell, there is a much higher potassium content inside the cell than outside, and a higher concentration of potassium inside than sodium. So we have a higher concentration of potassium inside than outside, and a higher concentration of potassium inside and a higher concentration of sodium outside. So there are some sentences here which we are not clear, but what they mean that we have a higher concentration of sodium outside and a higher concentration of potassium inside. Now, red blood cell is just like example, but almost all cells they have the same phenomena. So if respiration of red blood cell is inhibited, for example, with cyanide, ionic composition of the cell gradually changes until it comes into equilibrium with the plasma. This suggests that the ions can diffuse passively through the cell surface membrane of the cell, but that normally respiration supplies the energy for active transport to maintain the concentration shown in the figure above. So if we are performing the experiment, tukifanya experiment, then to inhibit the respiration led by cell, what we will observe is that ions will diffuse across the cell membrane and then later will come into equilibrium. The concentration of ions inside and outside of the cell will be the same. That is an experiment. So what is the implication of that experiment? That experiment implies that respiration is very important for provision of energy in the form of ATP, and this energy is important for active transport, which maintains the concentration of ions as how it was shown in the figure above. So if we could inhibit respiration and the concentration of ions could remain the same, now we couldn't have any implication about the active transport. But because the inhibition of the process of respiration tend to inhibit the process of active transport. And how do we know that it inhibits the process of active transport? It is because by inhibiting the process of respiration, we are seeing that the ions, they are coming into equilibrium. Now in other words, sodium is actively pumped out of the cell and potassium is actively pumped in of the cell. As how we see in the diagram, that the concentration of sodium ions outside is higher. So if we want to perform active transport of sodium ions, we must move them from outside to inside. That is active transport of sodium ions. But active transport of potassium ions, it is from inside to outside. This is done by the pump which is known as the sodium potassium pump. Now the rule of the sodium potassium pump is that it tends to pump sodium into the cell and potassium outside of the cell. Sodium potassium pump located at the cell surface membrane. Let's say here we have our pump. Here we have a pump on the cell surface membrane. And what does this pump do is that sodium potassium pump pumps sodium from outside to inside of the cell and pumps potassium from inside to outside of the cell. Remember, this pump uses ATP. This pump uses ATP because it is the pump which pumps sodium and potassium actively. So it is always known as the sodium potassium pump. This is how we shall discuss later. But this is how the concentration of ions is maintained across the cell surface membrane of many cells in the body. Cell surface membrane of many cells in the body. So what we are saying that the active transport is achieved by carrier proteins. Situated in the cell surface membrane. Unlike the proteins or the carrier proteins described above, unlike the situation described above for facilitated diffusion, the carrier proteins in this case, they are using ATP. That's the one major thing to describe, which is different from the first one. The carrier proteins in this case, they are using energy, or they require ATP in order for them to function. Is how they were required. So let me move to this page. Yeah, let's continue. Now, unlike the situation explained above about the facilitated diffusion, the carrier proteins involved in active transport need a supply of energy to keep changing shape. So in facilitated diffusion, we will discuss about the carrier proteins. But the carrier proteins in facilitated diffusion, they do not require energy in order to change their shape. While in active transport, the carrier proteins, they require energy in order to change their shape. Now, in recent years, it has been shown that the cell surface membrane of most cells have sodium pumps that actively pump sodium ions out of the cell. Actively pump sodium ions into the cell. Sodium pumps. They pump sodium ions into the cell. In the animal cell, the sodium pumps is coupled with a potassium pump, which actively move potassium ions from outside to inside the cell. So, it is out of the cell because out of the cell is against concentration gradient. Sorry for the some of the confusion which I explained in the previous diagram. I know for you ambao mtakuwa mnaangalia all minutes mtakuwa mmenielewa kile ambacho namaanisha. So what you mean that sodium will be pumped from inside to outside and potassium from outside to inside against concentration gradient. So in the previous diagram nilielezea by mistake. Now in animal cells, the sodium pump is coupled with the potassium pump, which actively moves potassium ions from outside to inside the cell. The combined pump is called the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pump. This is very common in many cell membrane. It's very common. Sodium-potassium pump is very common in many cell membrane and is responsible for many cellular activities in different categories of cell. So we are saying since this pump is the common feature of almost all animal cells and has a number of important functions, it provides a good example of active transport. Good example of active transport, it is a sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pump. Its importance is elevated by the fact that more than a third of ATP consumed by resting animal is used to pump sodium and potassium. Kwa hiyo ni zaidi ya 1/3 ya ATP zinazokuwa consumed na organism area rest zinatumika kwa ajili ya sodium potassium pump. Now the pump is a carrier protein. Pump with the carrier protein which spans the membrane from one side to the other. Spans the membrane from one side to the other. On the inside, it accepts sodium and ATP. Inside, it accepts sodium and ATP. While on the outside, it accepts potassium. So inside, sodium and ATP pumps them outside, while on the outside, it accepts potassium only. The transfer of sodium and potassium across the membrane is brought about by changes in the shape of the protein. And as we said that the changes in the shape of protein requires energy in the form of ATP. Note that for every 2 potassium taken into the cell, 3 sodium are removed. So the pump does not pump equal amount of potassium and sodium across the cell surface membrane. For every sodium which is pumped outside of the cell, for every 3 sodium which are pumped outside the cell, 2 potassium they are pumped inside of the cell. Thus, a potential difference is viewed across the membrane, and with inside of the cell being negative. Why negative? Because many sodium they are moved outside of the cell, while few potassium they are moved inside of the cell. Many sodium they are moved outside of the cell, while few potassium they are moved inside of the cell. That creates the negative potential inside of the cell. This tends to restrict the entry of negative charge or ions such as chloride. The negative potential which is present inside of the cell restricts the movement of the charges into the cell. So allow the movement of positive charges inside of the cell, but restrict the movement of negative charges like chloride ions into the cell. So now, this explains why the chloride concentration inside the red blood cell is less than outside, despite the fact that chloride can diffuse in and out by facilitated diffusion. So in the red blood cell, chloride ions, they can diffuse in and out of the red blood cell by facilitated diffusion. but their concentration inside is lower as compared to outside because of the positive charge established by the sodium potassium pump, and that positive charge tend to establish the negative charge inside of the cell, and due to that negative charge it makes more difficult for cold ions to accumulate inside of the cell. Similarly, positively charged ions or cations tend to be attracted into the cell. Thus, both concentration and charges are important in deciding the direction in which ions cross the membrane. Both concentration and charge, they are important in determining the direction through which ions will cross the cell. Now that's what we call as electrochemical gradient. We are considering the gradient of both electrical and chemical. Now, the pump is essential in controlling the osmotic balance of animal cell, that is osmoregulation. If the pump is inhibited, the cell swells and bursts because building up of sodium ions results in excess water entry the cell by osmosis. This explains why bacteria, fungi, and plant which have cell wall do not need the pump. So the bacteria and the fungi, they contain cell wall. So even the accumulation of the ions in the cytoplasm, and then the ions can accumulate water into cytoplasm. No problem, because accumulation of water does not lead to bursting of the cell because they contain cell wall which make the cell membrane protection. But in the case of animal cells, they require the pump for osmoregulation, maintenance of the amount of ions inside the cell, and thus due to maintenance of the amount of ions inside the cell, that will lead to osmoregulation and hence maintenance of water. But if the ions could not be maintained, that means even water could not be maintained, and thus at the end of the day we would end up with the bursting of the cell. The pump is also important in maintaining electrical conductivity in the nerve and the muscle cell. As we discussed in coordination about the maintenance of resting potential and things like that. If you remember, it is luck. If you don't remember, anyway, you can pass through my coordination videos. But what I want to talk here is that as we discussed about the resting and action potential, we saw that action potential requires sodium potassium pump. However, actually, action potential doesn't much require sodium potassium pump, but the resting potential requires much on the sodium potassium pump, because in the resting potential, the sodium potassium pump is the one which tends to restore from depolarization into repolarized state. Also, we are saying that also high concentration of potassium are needed inside the cell for protein synthesis, glycolysis, photosynthesis, and other vital processes. As we know, these minerals, they are used in different processes or in different functions of the body. Now here, the diagram which is present in the biological science book, and this diagram tends to explain how the potassium pump tend to appear. So I ask you to go in the BS book and look for this diagram in explanation of the active transport. Now let's move to other part, which is the importance of active transport. Why active transport is important in the body? Why not only passive transport? Now we discuss different aspects regarding the importance of active transport. But the first aspect is about the absorption of nutrients from the intestine into the blood vessels. As we discussed in the nutrition topic, that absorption of nutrients requires both diffusion and active transport. However, diffusion is good, or diffusion is used when the concentration of food particles in the intestine is higher as compared with the concentration of food substance in blood. But in case when the concentration of food substance in blood is high as compared to that present in the intestine, that means active transport should be applied, diffusion cannot function. Now we are saying that when the product of digestion are absorbed in small intestine, they must pass through the epithelial cell lining the gut wall. After that, glucose, amino acid, and salt pass through the cells of blood capillaries wall into the blood cell of the After that, epithelial cell lining. After that, glucose, amino acid, and salt pass through the cell of the blood capillary walls into the blood and then travel to the liver. Now, soon after feeding, relative high concentration of digestive food are found in the gut, and absorption is partially as a result of diffusion. However, this is very slow and must be supplemented by active transport. Such active transport is coupled to sodium potassium pump. So it tends to diffuse back in. Now we are saying that carrier protein are situated in the membrane, which requires both sodium and glucose to function. These are transported together by facilitated diffusion into the cell. So you can see the carrier proteins require both sodium and glucose to function, and all of these they can enter the cell through diffusion. Now a similar sodium amino acid carrier protein operates in the active transport of amino acids into the cell, the active part of the process being pumping back of sodium ions. So unaweza kuona hapo kwamba kuna different movement katika absorption. Kuna transporter ambaye anakuwa amekupo glucose with sodium, then tunaita glucose sodium co-transport, then tuna transporter ambaye anakuwa amekupo glucose na amino acid, sodium na amino acid co-transport. Hizo transporter zote kazi yake ni kuweza to make sure absorption of any product of free substance is done. Imefanyika. So yeah, that's the basic concept for you to understand in your level. So tunakupo hizo zote ili ziweze kufika shule kama hiyo. Now let's continue with another point. The second importance of active transport is used for reabsorption of useful material from uniferous tube of the kidney to the blood circulation system. So active transport also is the one which is responsible for the absorption or reabsorption of materials into the kidney tubules. Number 3, active transport help to maintain the resting potential of the nerve cell and muscle cell, is how I've already explained. Number 4, active transport is the rapid and selective absorption materials. So also, yeah, this is good. It's good. Active transport is the rapid and decided absorption of nutrients by the cell. Yeah, it's good. But yeah, Number 5, it is used in actively loading of sugar into phloem. We shall see this later, how loading of sugar into phloem, it is the active transport. It is the active transport. We shall see it later. Now, let's discuss about some few differences about the active and passive difference. Active and passive transport. What are the differences between them? In active, first it involves expenditure of crossing. Now, active, it involves expenditure of energy, but passive does not involve energy. Number 2, it occurs against concentration gradient. This occurs along. Carrier protein are required for active transport. Carrier proteins are not required. Then metabolic inhibitor stop the process. Active. Huku no rule of pure. Yes. Unaweza kuwa hapo kwamba metabolic inhibitor to stop process, huku ita stop rate decrease with increase in oxygen content, decreases with the decrease, huku rate is not affected. Yeah, rate of the process. Yes, active transport is rapid, passive transport. Yeah. Now let's